In recent years, direct-to-consumer advertising for drugs has become prolific. Many physicians argue that many illnesses or diseases are being, quote, pushed or promoted when illness or disease may not even be a disease in the first place, but ordinary aging or a normal emotional response. So to the whole panel, here's my question. What should we as society do to limit the medicalization of life?
Well, let me just start with what I've learned from my reading in the area of dietary supplements, and also called nutraceuticals. And that is, there is one theory, maybe you and I have talked about this over the reception, that all aging and all disease at its root foundation cause can be traced to inflammation. That's just one theory, or 90% of it. And that one thing that goes beyond this conference, but I think is an important, maybe ethical public health policy point to mention, is that in the U.S. we really need to do something better about our diets, and again, the good doctor over there was saying that many diseases are preventative, maybe 70% of them, and one way of doing that is with less inflammatory foods. It's just one observation.
Sunscreen. It's not because skin ages, period. Where do we start to stop that line?
I don't know if there's an ethicist in here or not. Maybe somebody else wants to give that. I want to live forever, if that's answers your question. I want to look good, too. What's that? Yeah. I don't know. I was joking. But I'm a dean, so some days I don't think that's probably the right thing to do. But I think it's a great question. I mean, I wish I'm not qualified to even answer that, but maybe somebody else could give it a shot here. Somebody from the philosophy department or somebody? There you go. I want to hear that answer.
Right. Well, so you have to answer the question before you're allowed to ask one of your own. So.
I'm going to ask another. I mean, it is posed as a clarification question, but I think it goes at sort of elucidating the difficulties we've been having here. So using this this innovation, or perhaps not quite an innovation, currently an invention that we just heard about, let me see if I understand what would then happen in the regulatory process. So if you said you put this stuff on and it's going to repair your DNA that's been damaged by the sun, then you're making a therapeutic claim, and it would have to be pre-market approved somehow. If you said, hey kids, wear this at the club and you'll get this cool blue glow, or for that matter, any other set of glows that you could tune it to, when the club turns on its UV light, you would not have to get pre-market approval for it, because it would be a cosmetic. If you made the health claim, you would come across the device or drug thing, because is what you made a laser, which presumably is a device, or because it's acting at that tiny little scale, a drug, because it's on maybe in your body. Have we got this right?
I think you're right on, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry. So much for that.
I was thinking similar thoughts as I was listening to that very provocative last talk, and that is, and of course it relates to the structure of the FDA and an office that of combination products, the Office of Combination Products, which is relatively new, which I think I mentioned the first day in a different context. And your product seems perfect for discussion by the Office of Combination Products. And I also noticed that in your three bar lines there for impact, there was no legal budget, which is kind of a little scary. You needed me early on, as well as needing an ethicist. But you know, at some point, I'm sure it occurred to you that you need to talk to the FDA about this. And the FDA, as we both noted at the ends of our talks here, is very, very open to in-person meetings to help you sort out all of these issues. So I'm wondering if you ever approached the FDA, if you're going to now, I'm sure.
No.
And set a meeting with someone at the Office of Combination Products. And I guess it's a question for you. Do you think that's the right?
The question to the gentleman's comments, I think, is that when you have a product, when we have a product before us, what are the claims? What is the indication for use? And how is that product going to be used by the consumer? So, you know, there will be different requirements with regard to pre-market review. But that being said, the product, whether it's used as a cosmetic or if it's used as a drug, there is a responsibility by the manufacturer to make sure that that product is not injurious or harmful. You know, regarding the question, the medicalization question, one way for the public to engage in this process about looking at claims is through these meetings, these public meetings that we have, you know, given it's product by product, but I think that's a very specific, focused input that the public can provide with regard to medicalization process issues. But it really depends upon the indication for use, the definition of what you've manufactured, which will define how we route it through the agency. And as Susan mentioned, there is an Office of Combination Products where maybe the lines are not as black and white as we'd like them to be. And there, you know, we have this process, primary mechanism of action, where we look at the article and figure out what exactly is the primary mechanism of action, because that will drive the regulatory process. It's not going to be the process driving, it's not going to be the review process driving how we look at that article. I hope that's clear.
So the discussion's been very interesting, and we've got to hear a lot about cosmetics. And I was curious to hear a little bit more from some of you about how things work with nanomaterials in foods. And you mentioned on one of the slides that the food additives, as I gathered, required pre-market approval, but maybe not in other cases with food. So I was wondering with nanomaterials, you know, how one distinguishes whether they count as a food additive or not. And then, you know, I gather, I don't know a lot about the details, but I hear about generally recognized as safe for the grass, and sort of how it would be decided whether nanomaterials would end up in that category. So anyway, I may not even know how to formulate the question, but if you could say a little bit about how it plays out with the food context, that would be great.
Yeah, there hasn't been a whole number of products with regard to food contact applications. When we have a new product that is a new identity that doesn't meet anything that we've seen before, and I should mention, you know, I'm more of a medical products review member, staff member at the FDA, so you know, I want to be responding in sort of a general fashion. If there's a new material or product that comes before the agency that would be classified as a food contact application or food additive, that we haven't seen before, and it doesn't meet something that we've generally recognized as safe, we would have additional questions for the manufacturers. And at the very least, the manufacturer would have a set of evidence that would establish the safety of that product before it reaches the market. So there's a presumption that there's some responsibility on the manufacturer with regard to those product classes. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, let me add a little bit. There definitely are nanotech foods and nanotech supplements. Two examples of foods are nanoparticle chocolate that supposedly tastes better, but also has that shinier glaze, like on a chocolate cake with the chocolate icing. You know, not great, not earth-shaking therapeutic benefit, but food attractiveness benefit. I think that was just marketed with no, it was not a new food additive, so it simply went to market. There are Nanotech cheeses and some dairy products that stay fresher longer, and those are already on the market. Some of this is documented, and there are citations in the chapter of the FDLI book that I passed along to the university. In terms of dietary supplements, it's an interesting question, and there may already be a framework to handle new nanotech supplement ingredients because of what I mentioned in my presentation. There is as part of the statute, DSHEA Section 8, if you have a new dietary ingredient that is chemically altered from an ingredient that was on the market before October of 1994, the enactment of the statute. If it's not chemically altered and it was on the market pre-October 94, then it's grandfathered in. So then the question becomes, and it's back to the physics-chemistry question in a way of yesterday, and that is your new nanotech, nanoscale dietary supplement ingredient, is it chemically altered? Like if you have nano lycopene or nanotech pomegranate or nanotech green tea extract, is it chemically different, chemically altered from that same ingredient that was on the market pre-October 94? And if it is, then there is a structure in place. It's called an NDI notification, which you submit to the FDA 75 days pre-market. And the FDA has that amount of time. You submit all of your safety evidence, and the FDA has that amount of time, and they usually do meet that deadline beyond all of their other huge priorities. And if you get essentially acknowledgement that, yes, you have submitted a safety science at the level of a reasonable expectation of safety for that new dietary supplement. Now notice it's not the GRAS standard. It's not what's required is not general recognition as safe, which is what GRAS stands for. And in my mind, there's a catch-22. There's a logical impossibility for a new ingredient to ever be GRAS. How could it be generally recognized as safe? So perhaps for that reason, dietary supplements are exempted from the GRAS requirement.
We have just a couple of minutes left, but I think if the questions and answers are relatively brief, we might be able to accommodate those who are at the microphone and those who've grabbed a microphone. So go ahead.
I'll be brief. Who's paying to answer these questions about biotoxicity and the release of nanomaterials into the environment? Maybe this is a good question for Dean Crawford. Who's ponying up the money, and is it enough to answer all these questions like the gentleman from the FDA posed?
It really depends. I think some of the larger corporations that are developing these things do have the resources to answer the questions, but what you'll see in the nanoscience area, because a lot of these sort of small startup companies are emanating out of the research enterprise from universities, is that they don't have the resources. And there's at least one, up in Chicago, there's at least one sort of interest group that's trying to help people make linkages between between what they're doing in their product side of things and how they can actually have them tested and what universities can possibly do it for them on cheaper and stuff like that. But I would say no, but it is nice to see, though, the sort of National Science Foundation also asking for you to think about these things in your grant proposals, because I think when you start off at the very beginning at the proposal stage and just ask what if, I think that's just far better than we have ever had in the past. And so I think we'll be able to flesh out some of these things. But I do think we're going to need more resources, in particular for the small companies, because it's expensive to run these toxicity trials, and those are the cheap ones, let alone animal studies and skin studies and human trials.
I actually have one other thought for your product, and that is, given that it's potentially such a very effective sunscreen, the FDA does not permit you to say sunblock, and given that we are fighting at least 2 wars in deserts, there's a possibility that DOD or some arm of the military might be willing to give you some seed money, and I don't know if you've already approached that possibility.
That's a good point. We have not. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also been some studies that have been supported by FDA on sunscreens, and I would encourage folks to keep track of the FDA website for those studies and some of the interesting findings we've been having, which are directly applicable to consumer use, specifically to TiO2 use on skin.
Okay.
First, maybe since there was a question put to the philosophers, just one comment on that. So should we step up to the plate a little bit at least? And I'm not going to answer the question whether when we consider UV damage to cells, whether we consider that actually an illness or whether this is part of the normal aging process. But what it does mean, I think, is that if you are thinking about incorporating ethics earlier in the research process, it doesn't just mean to think earlier about consequences and impacts. And don't put the ethics with the impacts and the consequences alone. But it does actually mean the ethics start when you start framing the question, is it even a problem, for example? So anyway, so this is just my comment, but my question is actually to take up a question that we had earlier that I raised on Tuesday afternoon. In the course of this conference, which is about regulation, I think there was a kind of tension between two different paradigms, and they came out very nicely today. I called it the chemicals paradigm on the one hand, where you basically just ask, is titanium dioxide safe, or whatever, what is the regulatory scheme for titanium dioxide? And then we ask the question, and what about nanoparticulate titanium dioxide and so forth? And you have basically a chemicals approach. And now we are talking about a products approach. How does a product work? And now it's actually a bit incidental whether it's nano or not. But of course, maybe if nano becomes important in the action of the product, we have to take that into consideration. So I wonder, as we try to find out what is a successful approach to regulation at all, how do these two paradigms relate to one another? Should we just jettison the chemicals approach because it's just too complicated to get general answers here and just go for the products approach? Or what is the interaction? Is it changing, or is it the same as it always has been?
So from FDA's perspective, the products approach is really clearly the best. But now I think from the products approach, that's the way FDA looks at evaluating the articles that are of interest to FDA. But you cannot evaluate that product profile without understanding the chemistry. So that's really the science-based investigation that you need to have before you, during the review, to look at that product for marketing. So maybe the framework is the product approach, but implicit in that framework is the chemistry and the physical, biological understanding that you need to incorporate into that product approach.
If I could, go ahead.
I'm going to try to maybe link us back to where Kathy started us those many days ago, and that's cross-disciplinary. When we think, we've spent a lot of time talking about, what is an identical chemical, et cetera. There are other groups that play in this arena that we haven't talked to. There's a recent case, I've just read a blurb, not the entire case, in the patent field under generic drug law over what is an identical chemical. Is it the active moiety? Is it not the active moiety, et cetera? So we are defining this, we're facing this question in a huge number of areas that require us to understand how these all link together.
If I could, and I agree with that, yeah, there are similar questions across different categories, whether it's a medical device, is it substantially similar, for a bioidentical generic. To take us back to sunscreens, again, sunscreens are governed under FDA law under over-the-counter drug monographs. And as I was just thinking about the monograph structure, which was set up in around the 1970s and 80s and is ongoing, it's a combination of a classification and a case-by-case, product-by-product basis. And the basic structure is that the FDA in advance sort of pre-approves certain active ingredients within a certain therapeutic range. My favorite easy example is an external analgesic, a cream like a Bengay or Icy Hot, an anti-inflammatory cream. And so in advance, the FDA has set up an external analgesic monograph and said you can use camphor or menthol or capsaicin or a few other anti-inflammatory ingredients at this, X to Y therapeutic range, and you can use 1 or 2 or 3 of them, some combination of those as your active ingredient, but you're limited to those active ingredients. Now, the problem with sunscreens is that the Sunscreen Monograph, I believe, just for various reasons, has been very problematic, and the FDA has been working on it, again, with loads of other priorities, including 9/11, off and on for about the last 10 years. As science evolves and we learn more about UA rays and UV light and so on, and I think that Sunscreen Monograph is in like a tentative final monograph form. And one of the permitted active ingredients is titanium oxide. Now, the question that's raised by this conference is, if in your product you are using nanoscale titanium oxide, does that have to be evaluated by the FDA and permitted as an active ingredient, or is any form of titanium oxide already permitted under the existing tentative final monograph? But then, of course, with Dean Crawford's product, you go beyond that mechanism of action, and in my mind, you're already beyond the existing sunscreen monograph.
Well, let me thank the panelists, if I could, for all of their comments and thoughts this morning.